If your warehouse runs on sticky notes, crossed fingers, and one person who just knows where stuff is, it's time for Endpoint. They connect your shop, stock, and shipments so you can stop playing hide and seek with inventory, and Gary can take some time off. Get real-time visibility and your sanity back at endpointas.com. And if you upgrade your warehouse before December 31st, you can take advantage of no payments for 90 days and 0% financing for up to 36 months. You may also be eligible to deduct up to 100% of your qualifying investment under Section 179. Consult your tax advisor to confirm eligibility. Terms and conditions apply. Learn more at endpointas.com. That's endpointas.com.
The New Warehouse Podcast, hosted by Kevin Lawton, is your source for insights and ideas from the distribution, transportation, and logistics industry. A new episode every Monday morning brings you the latest from industry experts and thought leaders. And now, here's Kevin.
Hey, it's Kevin with the New Warehouse Podcast, bringing you a new episode today. And on today's episode, I have an incredibly special guest. I'm very excited for this one. He is a keynote speaker. He's an advisor. He is a technology founder, and he has a very storied career within the supply chain space. And some people even told me he is a legend in supply chain. So it's going to be Rick McDonald, and he is the CEO and founder of Rick McDonald Supply Chain Advisory. And we're going to dive a little bit into his background, his career, and what he's seen over his years in the supply chain, and what he sees right now too as well, and what's kind of going on in the space, and how he's approached some different things within the supply chain, specifically within warehousing, distribution, and fulfillment, of course, here in the New Warehouse. And we're going to learn some things from him today. So, Rick, how are you?
Kevin, I am doing great. Thank you for such a generous introduction, and appreciate the invitation to be here with you and your audience today.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm excited to have you on. You know, we got connected earlier this year, and we was fortunate enough to have you as a guest speaker for some of my students. So I really appreciate that, and so did they, and had the chance to see you as a keynote speaker at Supply Chain Point earlier this year. So I'm happy that we could get you on the podcast and get some of these conversations recorded to share with a broader audience as well. So why don't you tell us a little bit about your background and your career in supply chain, because you've been at this for a little while. So tell us a little bit about kind of where you worked and what did you do, and you know, maybe some interesting experiences there.
I'm originally from Atlanta, went to Georgia Tech, played a little baseball there, could not hit a Division I curveball, so had to go get a real job, and started at Frito-Lay. Mm-hmm. So 10 years, 5 manufacturing plants, just an incredible company, great experience, great learnings, many of which I applied throughout the rest of my career. And I joined Clorox when it was a $1.7 billion, mostly U.S., almost all U.S. consumer packaged goods company. When I left after 32 years, the numbers were reversed. It was a $7.1 billion global consumer packaged goods company. And so it was a very interesting ride. I've really kind of traversed the supply chain from sourcing through to the customer. And I know I'm not unique in that way, but I grew up mostly in manufacturing and logistics, but I've also spent a good amount of time in procurement and planning. And those things really helped me when I got into larger roles, especially finishing up my career for the last 4 years as the Chief Supply Chain Officer at Clorox. And I think the most interesting things for me is, I'm old enough to remember when we used to do our overhead slides, use a pencil and a transparency, and you'd project screen. So the technology issues really amounted to a light bulb burning out on the versus anything more serious. So that one of the ways that I got started was a greased pencil and transparencies.
Interesting. Yeah. No, I mean, I remember that from when I was in elementary school, at least. So I have experience in that, but very interesting there. And obviously, huge jumps and leaps within, just the industry or business in general in that time. Right. And especially, Clorox and you mentioned going from 1.7 to 7.1 billion. And I mean, 1.7 is not a small business, right? But 7.1 is even bigger. So I'm curious, in that, I guess maybe first getting in there and then, growing and seeing that evolution of the supply chain itself. I mean, what's like one thing that people don't necessarily realize about when a supply chain gets to that scale and that robust to be able to support, a lot of products, which Clorox has, right? But just that size of business too.
It's a very diverse, all the way from food with Hidden Valley Ranch salad dressings to Burt's Bees to bleach, Clorox disinfecting wipes, cat litter, Kingsford charcoal, Brita water filters, Glad trash bags. It's a portfolio. And every supply chain is complicated. And I don't, supply chain is uniquely more complicated, but with the variety of technologies and capabilities, all of those products I mentioned are operated, of course, in different factories with different technologies. Some of them are incredibly capitally intensive, some not so much, all sorts of inventory turns and demand signal profiles. The one thing that seemed to keep going was the speed of the consumer. And how fast chains had to run to keep up with that consumer. And it varied country by country, of course, but certainly here in the United States and all over the world with the advent of, digital shopping and 24/7 shopping, 365, the speed of the customer is what supply chains have to work to keep pace with. That's one of the things I'm proud of at Clorox. I think we did a pretty good job of keeping pace with the consumer in terms of how fast and how quickly they wanted to order our products and where they wanted to receive them.
Interesting. Yeah. And that's a very interesting point because I imagine in that time, right? I mean, you certainly saw a lot of different changes in consumer style and what consumers were looking to, I guess, buy and how they're looking to buy. As you mentioned, they're bringing into that digital shopping and things of that nature. So I'm curious, like, what was like one point where, you kind of saw where, okay, the way people shop is going to really change, right? It's not just going to be about brick and mortar anymore. Like, what was there something or like a time that you can remember where it was just like, oh wow, like this is kind of the future?
Yeah, I think the pivot came about gradually but quickly, if that makes any sense, when Amazon stopped selling books and started selling everything else. And then others were fast following, trying to catch up with their technology model. I mean, they're basically a huge technology company that happens to sell and distribute some products.
Yeah.
I think that was a real pivot point for a lot of us in the supply chain. Prior to that, it was the advent of the club channel and what used to be called the hypermarkets, which turned out to be, Walmart and Target and many others.
Okay.
Those three things, I think, were pivotal moments in supply chains where we had to adjust, we had to adapt. Shopper behavior, shopper experience is very different in just those three channels I mentioned, never mind traditional grocery and drug.
We'll be back after a quick break.
Today's episode is brought to you by the Breckham Group, a supply chain consulting firm built by operators and engineers, not just advisors. Their experienced team helps companies bridge the gap between strategy and execution inside distribution centers using a proven framework called Precision Supply Chain Operations. The result? Faster performance, greater efficiency, and real ROI. If you need speed, precision, and measurable results, visit breckhamgroup.com. Yeah, interesting, and I think it's really interesting to hear that and kind of how a large corporation like that was approaching something like that, because I think, back when e-commerce and things like that were just kind of getting started, I think there was some skepticism, I think, from a lot of people, like, well, are you going to trust people to put my credit card information on the internet, right? And all these things, right? But now we look at it and it's like not a second thought, right? I mean, it's like, yeah, of course, order
Not
right
at all.
now, right?
Not at all.
Yeah. Very interesting. So tell us a little bit about, when you looked at some of these evolutions and saw some of these things happening, how did you approach kind of innovation and technology throughout your career? Like, how did you look at things? Because we certainly have gotten to a point now where, the market is just flooded with solutions, right? I mean, there's some kind of tech solution for every little kind of potential problem and niche down thing, I think, that you could think of in a supply chain, right? So how did you navigate that, and how did you kind of maybe steer away from like a shiny object, right? But figure out like, okay, what is actually viable for this supply chain, and what can we actually execute upon?
That's a really good question. Let me start with two things that really haven't changed in this equation. And I'll go analog and then digital. I'll do the analog part really quickly. The two things that haven't changed is all of this, whatever it is you do, whether it's on a spreadsheet or it's a workflow or training of your staff, your employees, all of it is in service of the consumer. It has to be in service of the consumer. And the second thing, it has to be in service of solving a material enough problem that you have. And I'll get to why that one is really important here in just a second, and why I think some of the digital transformations that are happening, or at least some single point solutions, are not succeeding. But those two things, consumer obsession, and then making sure that you're actually attending to your most pressing problems. The second one sounds like, well, of course you would, but sometimes it's really easy, as you pointed out just a minute ago, to run after a shiny object versus, sort of focusing on what you really have to address. And so we moved to the digital world, and honestly, I think there's a lot of AI fatigue right now.
Oh, yeah.
Inboxes are inundated with pitches versus companies trying to understand what problems a particular manufacturer or distributor has to solve. And that's one of the pieces of advice I give to the technology founders that I'm advising is, don't start with your pitch, start with understanding whether that manufacturer, that distributor has a problem that your gear might solve. And then you've got the basis for a conversation. Otherwise, it's a little bit of a waste of everybody's time. But I think the way this all starts is, and what's important, and what we did at Clorox was we built a roadmap. And we looked at risks as a way to help inform that roadmap: financial risk, reputational risk, customer risk. And that roadmap was intended to address specific known problems that we had in the supply chain, and a few that we uncovered along the way that I think we didn't think were as significant as they were, but they also made the roadmap. And we went out and we tried to decide, okay, can this best be addressed by changing a workflow, by changing some behaviors, by changing something we're doing? That's obviously the simplest and fastest way to make improvements. Second thing was, did we need different performance from the people, the human beings who were involved in that activity? Could we raise the standard and train people to do something different that would attend to that problem? And then if neither of those were really possible, then we looked at digital solutions. And in every case, we brought our IT group along with us. This is not one of these things where I would not advise kind of lone rangering this.
Yeah.
And being out there by yourself, you need to have your CIO, whoever that person is, your arm around their shoulder, and the two of you aligned on what you're trying to accomplish, because you both need each other when you're trying to solve these really significant problems with a digital asset. And so that inventory of problems, force ranked. Obviously, in every company, you're competing for scarce resources, both financial and human, to implement these large-scale projects. And I always found that developing a business case with a return that I was committing to and that I would actually remove from my budget when we were successful was the best way to get attention and funding for some of these initiatives. And then it's about going out and selecting the potential research on the problem we were trying to solve and who we thought could best attend to that. The sandbox work with multiple potential suppliers, was very telling in terms of what they said their capability was versus what we actually found. And I don't think there was anything necessarily disingenuous about that. I truly believe they believe what they believe. But at the same point in time, it wasn't a sharp enough tool for the issues that we were trying to resolve. And then the last thing I'd say about this is one thing that we did not do well in the initial foray into the Clorox digital supply chain, digital transformation of supply chain, was change management. We had a pretty big swing and miss on the planning capability that we installed that took the place of SAP APO. We thought we'd done a really good job of change management. We were sort of doing the high five and, getting ready to haul the trophy out and put the names on the back of our shirt and everything. And like day 2 with this fantastic capability, we still had our planners running around with spreadsheets. And week 2, they were still doing the same thing. And we're kind of scratching our heads. And what we finally understood was we had really not done a very good job of helping them with the change management of what this tool would do, because the one big difference, or several big differences, but one of the biggest that affected planners was run rates were dynamic in the tool. They were constantly changing. Whereas a planner might go in and every quarter, every 6 months, tweak a run rate. And so it would give different recommendations with that cycle versus with a dynamic cycle. And they just weren't used to the types of recommendations they were seeing. And they thought they were wrong. So we had to kind of go back and reteach them, upskill them more. And that wasn't on them. That was on us. That was on me. And we learned from that, and we did some things very differently in subsequent elements of the digital transformation.
Interesting. Yeah. And I think I gotta say, when you were saying like AI fatigue there, and you're getting these email pitches, it's like pitches for AI generated by AI potentially to your inbox, right? But I think that's really interesting to hear kind of how you looked at some of these things and kind of the approach there, and that change management piece I think is such an interesting thing. And I love that you admit that, like, hey, we got something wrong here in trying to roll this out effectively, but really interesting point there that, or I guess experience there, that, the technology was so, I guess, different from what traditionally they had seen, that they didn't trust it and they didn't believe it. So I'm curious, when we look at this, this age of kind of AI and more quickly generated results and data analysis and things like that, how do you recommend or advise people to be able to, I guess, alleviate some of that skepticism or mistrust in information that should be right, but looks very different from what maybe they're used to seeing?
Yeah. I love that question, and it is directly related to change management. I will say that we, after this first foray into transforming part of the supply chain, the planning capabilities, demand, supply, and inventory, we realized we didn't really know what we were doing with regard to change management. So we went out and hired a third party. And I'll give Mercer a shout out here. They came in and in a short period of time, basically built us a playbook on how to think about change management in this space. And it started with eliminating fear and inspiring and introducing confidence into the equation, because this is going to be a change for everybody. The second thing was we did small focus groups, and we asked people what was on their minds. What were they concerned about? What were they excited about? And in every cohort, every group of employees, you've got 3 pretty distinct groups, and of course, a little bit of gray in between. But you've got the people on the one end. They're going to go and go and go. You almost nothing you can do will stop them from being great in the new technology. On the other end, you have the people who are either quietly or vocally really against this sort of change, because it is a concern necessarily for them around They have to learn something new. It is change. It's different. What if they can't do it? All those fears, those fears we have inside of us possibly, and the confidence level we have in ourselves, those all emerge. Then you got a big group in the middle. And what you really got to try and do is move that big group in the middle towards the top end of the curve. And then you've got to try and bring this other group that is very fearful and maybe even objecting and, digging their heels in. You got to move them to a place where they can at least be neutral. If you can't do that, then it's a little bit of coach up or coach out. But what we learned was when we got those fears on the table, we were really able to kind of plan how we wanted to talk about what we were changing, how we were changing, why we were changing. What was it? What wasn't it? And if you don't tell the story, somebody else will. And generally they're going to make up a much more negative version than is actually true. And so we learned a lot in those next few weeks and months about how to go from, we've got an idea, we've got a concept, we're going to make a change. Now, how do we enroll people in what we're going to be doing and at least have them get to a neutral stance before we get going?
Yeah, and I think that's such a great way to put it, is the story there, right? Because it is so important to understand that why, right? And also understand, exactly what it is and what isn't it, as you said. But I think it's a very interesting point there, because, one person that has, some influence with their peers or something like that starts to talk negatively about it, right? I mean, that quickly ripples, right, throughout departments or the organization or the facility, whatever type of situation you're in. And I think it's really a great point to be able to, tell, I guess, the real story, right, before these other stories start to bubble up, and then there's all kinds of confusion and the skepticism is there and all these different things. And like you said, I mean, you have these people that will, they embrace it and they run with it, right? And they're kind of like first movers on it, and that's great. But the ones that are like a little hesitant or slower to adopt and get used to it, that's where you got to put the focus, right, in that concentration. So really, really interesting there. So now tell us a little bit about, this is, the new warehouse podcast, right? So we got to talk about warehousing a little bit. So tell us kind of like, what are you seeing in the warehousing market right now? What's kind of your take on the current state of warehousing, distribution, fulfillment, that part of the supply chain?
It is one of the areas of the supply chain where I think there is a lot of opportunity for better, improved, different automation, all the way from case picking to truck loading to everything in between. The way warehouses work best is when the work efficiently comes from the back office, if you will, to the floor, and then it gets done efficiently at the floor level. And what I see is a lot of people trying to make operations better and different inside warehouses. AGVs, they're almost 70 years old now.
Yeah.
The first ones. So there's a long history of using those types of vehicles, but I see even more sophistication now. I'm hearing and learning about technology in the picking space, picking cases and cartons, not quite to each as yet, but cases and cartons at a pretty high rate and with a high level of accuracy to aid the warehousing people who are doing that activity. And I see a lot of automation sort of on either end of things, the inbound and the outbound, that synchronization of the warehouse, if you will. All those things are lining up well against what we started with, which was operating at the speed of the consumer, and being able to handle more with the same space. I also think that warehouses are, there's still going to be the 1 million square foot boxes being built. Plenty of them here in the Atlanta area going up right now. But I also think there's going to be a lot of room for smaller fulfillment centers closer to developing and growing centers of shoppers. Maybe the 250, 300,000 square foot warehouse. As technology advances, clear heights that are going to go well above 30 feet and capability to not sacrifice efficiency for cube utilization. So I think all those things are coming together in a variety of ways to make warehouses more oriented to serving the consumer, but serving at a faster pace.
Mm. Interesting. Yeah. Yeah. And I think it is interesting to see all of these different technologies that are coming in, and I think it's very cool too. I mean, I love that it's coming into our industry, and I get to talk about it all the time. That's fun, definitely. But interesting point there too about the spaces themselves, like getting closer to that consumer, but also going higher, right, and being able to do that, and I certainly have seen some of that in the cold storage space, like particularly 100-foot kind of ASRS crazy systems that are out there. But when you look at the space itself, how does that kind of tie into demand planning, and what is that doing for kind of the warehouse space that is out there? Is we need more? Do we need less? Is there too much? What do you see in the relationship there?
It's a really good segue. And of course, this is one of those interesting complexities of supply chain, and it is a chain, so everything is related.
Sure.
My take on this is there have been some interesting improvements in the ability to harvest a better demand signal. But most of us are still stuck with, 45, 50, 55%, 60% demand forecast accuracy. That requires several different possibilities. Either you got to have a lot of manufacturing capacity, which tends to be pretty expensive for, sort of a just in case scenario, or you've got to have big buildings and lots of inventory. Yeah. And most of us have chosen the balance sheet route. And so therefore we have hundreds of millions of square feet of warehousing space in this country holding inventory for a demand signal that isn't good enough. And demand signals will never be perfect, so you'll never hear me advocate for that, but I do think we can do better. And some of the tools that I'm coming across, and actually a company I advise called KetaQ is a leader in this adaptive planning space for demand planning, supply planning, and inventory optimization. And where it's different, and where I think this is going to go, different than the legacy tools, is the engine that's running. Instead of doing a single calculation as some of the legacy tools do, and then you've got to adjust it and run another one, then you've got to adjust it and run another one. And who knows how many times you may have to do that to get to what really is the optimum solution. This engine runs thousands of calculations literally in seconds and produces in minutes the optimal solution for that problem that you're trying to solve to connect your demand with your supply, with your inventory. And what I think that's going to do, and what they've been demonstrating with customers, is a significant increase in forecast accuracy. 10 points, 15 points, 20 points.
Oh, wow.
And, just envision what that means for your confidence and how much safety stock you would not need to have, how much raw material safety stock you would not need to keep. So it's going to have a settling effect across the entire supply chain and really improve that orchestration and the synchronization across the supply chain, because you get that better demand signal. All of a sudden, there are not as many changes to the production wheel. There are not as many changes to the supplier's schedule. They're tier 2s, they're tier 3s. Now, all of a sudden, you get a much smoother flow through the supply chain, which better attends to consumer pace and what needs to be on shelf. Retailers will like it because on-shelf availability will go up. They're not going to be stuck with a whole lot of B item and C item, C levels safety stock in their warehouses. So it's gonna really have a profound impact, I think, across the supply chain.
Very interesting, and interesting to hear about that technology too as well. And I think it's interesting to think about that and the actual kind of demand planning and forecasting accuracy, and just think about like probably how much potentially used warehouse space is out there that is not necessarily needed, right? In a sense, right? And as I think about that, I'm kind of like, oh, if we actually get to this point with AI and all these different technologies that's dialing more into more accurate forecasting and demand planning, like what does that look like 40, 50 years ago from now, right? And is there a bunch of empty space, or how does that happen? So it'd be interesting to see kind of that evolution there. And I'm curious, what are you seeing or hearing in the industry from, I guess, in relation to the tariff situation around this, right? Because I've heard like mixed, right? I've heard some people are like, oh, we're trying to bring in a bunch of inventory before these deadlines, and some people are like, we're just going to wait and see. So what are you kind of hearing out there?
Yeah. It's interesting. My point of view, and I think you and I might have even talked about this, and I've said this a few times. My initial reaction to the idea of tariffs were they were going to be relatively short-lived. They were going to be mostly for economic improvement, and there'd be agreements, and then on we'd go. I'm now changing my point of view on that. I think they're going to be an ongoing feature of this administration. They're not only being used for economic purposes, but non-economic purposes, and they're quite a lever. You know, what I see manufacturers and distributors doing, everything from what you suggested, very proactive. You know, many of us started thinking about this even before the election and anticipating it, and even before that, at Clorox, when I was still in the chief supply chain officer seat, we started working our way out of some of our suppliers in China, even a couple of years ago. Just not knowing with the political uncertainty in that region and how things were going to go, we just could not afford to have manufacturing and goods and WIP trapped in China if something occurred.
Right.
So some companies have taken more of a proactive approach. There are those who have kind of done the wait and see. And in some ways, they're paying the price a little bit if they have not explored bonded warehousing, if they haven't looked at free trade zones, if they haven't looked at, one of the most simple things that all of us could do is stare at the materials that are being tariffed and see if they qualify in some other category. Can they be reclassified? A lot of companies are taking that action and legitimately finding that goods that they have been paying tariffs on actually belong in a different classification. So all those things are things that, that we can do now. This idea of a better demand signal also supports that, because if you're not manufacturing and importing more materials than you need just in case, and because your demand signal isn't very good, you're going to avoid not only having that material sit on your balance sheet, but also the tariff impact of it in the moment.
Yeah, very interesting. And obviously this has been a hot topic. So we've talked about this on the podcast with a couple of different people, but the reclassification, I think that's the first time that's come up in one of these conversations. So I think that's a interesting point there as well. And I think it is interesting to see just how ongoing this is, right? And the shifting and the changing. And, I think there's just the big question of when does it just get to a steady state, whatever it's going to be, right? And where is it going to be? Somewhere where people can, I guess, maybe effectively plan around it and their business, right? And especially for some of the smaller and medium-sized kind of e-commerce brands that have been so dependent on international kind of manufacturing and things like that. So very interesting.
On that, Kevin, just one point related. This idea of stability, I think, is a really good one. And obviously business would love that a lot, both from a financial reporting perspective and a forecasting perspective. But, in some ways, it's a little bit like experiences I've had in international, I think others have as well, when you operate in countries where inflation rates are through the roof, there are devaluations, there are all sorts of changes to currency and monetary instruments. And I'm not suggesting that we're getting to that point or we will get to that point, but in those countries, it was just a routine thing that we were going to have to forecast and reforecast, and pricing changes were just sort of day-to-day fabric, if you will. I'm not again suggesting that we're here in the U.S. like that, but there are some elements of it in that instability that seem to be mimicking what I've experienced in some smaller international countries.
Interesting. Yeah. It'll definitely be interesting to see how that continues to develop and evolves over time. So now if we look at kind of the future state of warehousing and these distribution centers, and we talked a little bit about maybe how the space might change a little bit, but what do you see as some of kind of the because you were at ProMat, right? You were a speaker at ProMat this year,
Yeah.
right? And obviously, you walk in there and it's like your head is spinning with the different solutions and robots and automation, all these different possibilities for an operation, right? But from your perspective, like, what do you see is going to stick, and what does that kind of warehouse distribution center in the future look like to you?
Yeah. Well, let's start with something that we talked about a couple different times earlier in our chat here today. One is, all of it's got to be around the obsession you have with your consumer. Mm-hmm. And so it's all got to be purposed towards that. And, as we mentioned a few different times, it is about the supply chain speeding up. If you think about it, I'm not going to go deep into this, but if you think about the idea of even agentic shoppers,
sure,
basically your personal shopper that's running 24/7, 365, finding things that you want at the price you want, the color you want, that your influencer recommended, that is going to add another element of speed, I think, to the supply chains. And so all of what we're doing has to be in service of that. I see automation continuing, of course, in the operations, but I also see a lot more room for automation sort of getting the work to the floor, inducting carriers and drivers into the drop lots, creating more synchronization, because this is all in service of driving out losses, driving out waste. That's a lot of what these digital tools are helping us do. They're helping us identify and drive out losses. And I think there's a lot more room to improve the orchestration, the smoothness, if you will, of how distribution centers operate from the moment the carrier hits that driveway until the moment they leave. There are lots of times that it's just not nearly as smooth as it needs to be. And some of that is things happen. It's not a perfect world, but some of that, the issues are well known, but yet they're not well known by everyone. And so the carrier showing up expecting X, the warehouse knows it's Y, but there's no way to communicate that in a timely manner so that driver could be really doing something different. So I think there's going to be a lot more of that attempt at visibility and orchestration and faster communications, especially when the plan is not going according to plan, and really making dynamic in the moment changes versus having fixed schedules.
Yeah. And I think that's a great point, because there is, you mentioned, earlier, this, AI fatigue and this flood of pitches in your inbox, right? And I think that, somebody that was not kind of like deep into the industry and really understanding, a lot of that could seem like, oh, this, everybody's using AI, everybody's using robots, right? And all this thing, but the penetration is very, very small still, right? So to your point, I mean, there's a lot of gap to still fill with these digital solutions to be able to get to where, a lot of warehouses are operating smoothly, right? And I'm curious, and this would be my last question to you here. It made me think, when you got into supply chain, right, and you started to see some of these things, what was like the first thing that like stood out to you that was like why do we do things like this? Like, this doesn't make any sense? Like, what was like that first big surprise to hear, there was some process maybe that was a little disjointed or just didn't quite make sense to you?
Well, there were probably several of those. The one that's coming to mind is I'm just going to come to coordination. The coordination between discrete activities in a manufacturing plant. I grew up as a manufacturing person, 5 different Frito plants, 2 more at Clorox, and then over my career, I don't even know how many of my company's plants and other people's plants I've been in. It's got to be in the hundreds.
Yeah.
And the disjointed nature of how some of the processes don't connect even under the same roof. And, that's something we as supply chain professionals have to own. We can do much better in terms of workflows. We can do much better in terms of training. We can do much more in terms of being advocates for the right digital assets to solve the right problems. What that means is each of us has to be a lot more digitally fluent. So we don't fall for or get running after the shiny object in the corner. We don't have the fear of missing out, and all of a sudden we end up buying something that either doesn't solve our problem or maybe even in the right solution set range, but it sounds good. It sounds like it's going to. And so we make a run at it. So we've all got to become much more informed about our problems, our issues, and then what are those digital solutions that might be able to attend to those. And that requires us to do our own self-study and learning and kind of sorting through this, kind of cutting through the clutter of your inbox and AI fatigue to get to the really reallys.
Yeah. And I love that. And that's a great point and great advice to end on there. And I think that, that is so important to have awareness about what's going on with these technologies and solutions when there's so many now in the space, and just have a curiosity about it, right? Because it may be something you learn about now. It's not applicable now, but a year from now, 2 years from now, there's a problem, and about that solution. So, and a great way to do that is to listen to the New Warehouse podcast to learn about those things.
Absolutely.
So, really appreciate you coming on here, Rick, and talking to us and sharing some insights from all your experiences and what you're seeing in the market right now. And you have a couple speaking engagements coming up, right? So if people want to learn more from you or see you at certain places, what's the best place to do that?
Yeah, so I am pretty active on LinkedIn, and I would say that's the very best place to see the latest and greatest. I'll be at a Richmond Events supply chain conference in Phoenix in September. And then in October, I've been invited to speak at a similar conference run by Millennium Events in Munich, Germany. And so that's going to be a fun time. I'll be at NACES. I'll also be at Gartner in December, and look forward to seeing folks there.
All right, fantastic. And we'll definitely put all that information at thenewwarehouse.com as well as in the show notes, so people can find Rick, track him down, connect with him, and learn some more from this great guy. So Rick, thank you very much for coming on the show today.
You've been listening to the New Warehouse Podcast with Kevin Lawton. Subscribe and check us out online at thenewwarehouse.com.
Enjoyed this episode? Make sure you are subscribed to the podcast, and for more content from the New Warehouse, find us on LinkedIn and YouTube. Links to subscribe can be found in the show notes, and for everything The New Warehouse, head to thenewwarehouse.com.